1 Samuel 14. We're going to take a look at some quotes about war before we get into this, because there's a big difference between the way that Jonathan seems to approach his enemies and the way that his daddy Saul seemed to approach his enemies. Do you remember we talked about the fact that Jonathan attacked the outpost of the Philistines at Gilgal, and that started an uprising, and then that led to Saul making that terrible decision about making his own sacrifices, not waiting on Samuel to get there? Okay. I want you to get that in your mind, because not only does it show us a little bit about who Saul was becoming, but it also shows us this rift between Saul and Samuel. So you have a very strong religious leader of the country, and you have the anointed king of Israel, and the two of them are not getting along. So there's definitely a problem. But here are some quotes. The first one is from George Patton. "Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best. It removes all that is base. All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood." Does that not sound like Patton? All right, it's a very strong statement. Duty is the essence of manhood. The second one is from Bernard Montgomery. He was sometimes known as Monty, but he was a general in both World War I and World War II in Great Britain. "Every soldier must know before he goes into battle how the little battle he is to fight fits into the larger picture, and how the success of his fighting will influence the battle as a whole." I like that quote. If you tell a young man who's going into battle that there's really a reason for him taking that hill right there, it's different than if you just say, "Hey, go take that hill." If there's no reason and they see no long-term advantage to doing these things, then it's much harder to keep them motivated to doing those things. Well, both of those things are interesting because Jonathan kind of shows both of these. He's very brave. He's somebody who's not afraid to take it to the enemy. And he's someone who kind of has a picture of what his little bit might do as far as the rest of the battle is concerned. All right, so chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. "One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, 'Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side.' But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree at Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez, the other called Seneh. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Jeba." So you have kind of an interesting description of this area, and I've always thought of it like a famous battleground, like we might go to visit Gettysburg or Shiloh, right? We get this description that if you're on vacation and you get to this place, then you know there's that cliff and there's that cliff and here's where Jonathan was, and you can almost reenact the battle in your own mind. If not, I don't think they ever did battle reenactments like they do for Civil War battles. But nobody is aware at this point that Jonathan has left. That becomes important in the latter part of this chapter, and we'll look at it next week. But he and his armor bearer are going to make a huge decision. Verse 6, "Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. So you get a really good impression of who Jonathan is. He is not waiting on Daddy, who's sitting under the pomegranate tree. The guys who are with his daddy are royalty. They are commanders. They are religious leaders. They're all waiting. They're all sitting under a tree, not doing anything to move the battle on or to make a difference as far as how things are going. Now, all these years I've looked at this passage and it never dawned on me, but I want to go back up to verse 2 and just read a couple of verses here. And this is your pop quiz for the evening. What's wrong with this picture? Saul was staying at the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. What's wrong with that picture? Eli's family is not supposed to be doing anything in leadership in Israel. God took the priesthood away from Eli. You remember who Ichabod is? Ichabod is the baby that was born at the same time that Phinehas is reported dead in battle. Right? The news gets back. They tell his wife, who is about to give birth, that he has died, and so she goes into labor, has Ichabod, which means the glory has left Israel. Eli falls off of his chair, breaks his neck. So all of that family should be out of the priesthood. Why does Saul have this young man wearing an ephod with him in the camp? Well, my guess is because he's mad at Samuel. Samuel told him after the last encounter that God was going to take the kingdom away from him. He said, if you'd have done what God told you to do, God could have turned your family into a dynasty. But since you didn't do what God told you to do, he's going to take the kingdom away from you. So Samuel is not in the camp, but one of Eli's descendants is. Saul has a different priesthood at work that does not work for Samuel. So he's sitting under a tree. He's got the wrong priest in the camp. Jonathan's about to do something great. Saul is not. So again, the more I get to know Saul, the less I am impressed by him. But notice the great statement that Jonathan makes at the end of verse 6. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. It's one of the greatest quotes of the Old Testament. I think it's applicable to all kinds of situations. It's applicable to small churches. God can work through small churches. He doesn't have to have a mega church to do his work. He can have a small congregation and use that few people to do what he needs to get done. He can use people who are surrounded by others who are not doing anything, and he can use that one person or those few people to step up and do something important for the kingdom. But a tremendous quote from Jonathan, because Jonathan was impatient, just sitting around waiting on his dad to act. Now, notice the brilliance of the game plan, beginning of verse 7. The armor bearer said to him, do everything that you have in mind. I am with you, heart and soul. Jonathan said, come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes that they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. So Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and the field, those in the outposts and the raiding parties. The ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. So here's the real importance of what Jonathan does. First of all, his battle strategy is right up there with the greatest battle strategies of the Old Testament. Think in terms of, let's walk around the city 7 times, blow on trumpets, and shout. Okay? That was Jericho. Jericho, the walls fell down. When they were still out in the desert, God told Moses to go up on the hill and hold up the rod above his head while Joshua was leading the battle against the Amalekites down in the valley. And as long as Moses held the rod of God up in the air, then Israel prevailed. If his arms went down, then they lost. So Aaron and Hur came and held Moses' arms up so that they would continue to win down in the valley. So God took care of it. Again, how do you win a battle like that? Well, if God is in it, then you're going to be victorious. How about grab 5 stones in a slingshot and run out against the giant from the Philistines? If God's not in it, you're in big, big trouble. But if God is in it, then things are going to work out. So the Philistines have the same kind of response here that the Amalekites had when Gideon went against them. God strikes them with terror, and they begin to actually fight with each other. They're so afraid that anybody that comes close enough, they're in terror for their lives, and they're actually killing more with friendly fire, as we would say, than perhaps the Israelites were killing. Now, here's what unfolds. The first person that Jonathan influences is his armor-bearer. Now, his armor-bearer would have been a younger man who was assigned to basically carry all the stuff that Jonathan needed to have carried. Jonathan was royalty, and he was a commander in the army. So he would have somebody whose job was basically show up and carry stuff. And this young man would have learned about war from Jonathan. He would have learned about life from Jonathan. And evidently, this young man trusted Jonathan enough to follow him, or was at least willing to do whatever it was that Jonathan told him to do. So you go back to that original quote from Patton where he says, all men are afraid in battle, but the coward is one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. It may be that this young man just had a sense of duty. It was his job to go wherever Jonathan went. So his answer to Jonathan is, you tell me what we're doing, and we'll go do it. He also has a sense in which there's something bigger happening here. Right? We're going to start something, and maybe it has a ripple effect. Maybe other people get involved, but we're going to get things started. First of all, he influenced his dad, who was still sitting under the tree. Now, the response of his dad is odd and not the way that God would have had it done. Right? So the first thing that Saul does is he calls his group together, and he says, if the enemy is running away, there must be somebody chasing them. Find out who's missing from among our number. So he takes the time to gather all the troops together and do a head count. He doesn't join in the battle. He doesn't order somebody to, we'll follow up and, let's advance. He just says, well, let's count. So when they count, they find out that it's Jonathan and his armor bearer that are missing. So we get that far. Then Daddy says, well, maybe we need to back them up. But wait, before we do that, let's bring up the ark. In other words, let's inquire of the Lord. But while he's bringing the ark up to be overseen by the descendants of Eli, who shouldn't have been there in the first place, when they bring the ark up, the battle changes enough and they're running away enough that Saul changes his mind and does not ask what God wants him to do. And again, when we look at the second half of this next week, you'll see that he makes some bad decisions because he doesn't inquire what God wants him to do. He decides he's the king and he's going to make decisions, and he makes some decisions that are absolutely the wrong decision. He gave pride to those who were not strong in their allegiance to Israel. Do you notice that the first group that joins in the battle is a group of people who had gone over to the enemy side? Right? The Philistines have some turncoats that are fighting for them. And as soon as the battle shifts and the Philistines are getting beat, then all of a sudden the Israelites who were with Philistia change their minds, and they pick up their weapons and they join the Israelites in the battle. Not necessarily the best soldiers that you would ever have, that they're going back and forth between the armies, but Jonathan's incentive when he starts fighting the enemy brings them back to their senses, or gets them into a situation where they can serve, and they do well. Where I grew up, this reminds us of Dallas Cowboy fans. Sometimes they're really, really good fans, and then something goes wrong, and then all of a sudden they're not great Dallas Cowboy fans anyway. He gives courage to the cowards, the ones that are living in the rocks and in the caves, that are hiding out. There were some of the Israelite army that the last time Saul was in charge left. Remember, he started with about 3,000, ended up with about 600. So you've got some that are just hiding. They don't want to be conscripted. They don't want to be in the army. So they're hiding out wherever they can hide out. And as a result, he didn't have the size of an army that he hoped that he would have. And maybe Saul would have done something differently if he'd had more men at his disposal. But he, again, sat under the tree and did nothing while Jonathan went and finally took the battle to the enemy. So when Jonathan acts, he sets in motion a lot of different things that end up being a great victory for the Lord. And of course, the Lord enters in by confusing the enemy and causing them to panic and to run away from the battle. What could we do as individuals? What could we do as a congregation? What could we do as a church in Northwest Texas? What could we do as a church in the United States if we could get enough Jonathans to just take the battle to the enemy, to step up and go do something, and to take that attitude that says, well, God can deliver by many or by few. And I may not be many, but I'm going to do something. And once I start doing something, then maybe some other folks will join with me, and we can advance the kingdom to some greater level. In the past, I think we've looked to Bible class teachers, preachers, maybe elders, deacons, to kind of take that role and step out and say, okay, here's the program, here's what we're going to go do. And that's legitimate. But there are people within just the general rank and file, if you will, of the church who have gifts and who have abilities that they could be using to reach out to the people around us. but it becomes comfortable when none of us do anything. We just kind of sit under the tree, and we can come up with lots of reasons why we don't do stuff instead of any of us deciding that we're going to do something, and then perhaps others will join in. And there are, of course, kind of correlations between the kind of people. He influenced his armor bearer. All of us have people immediately close to us, family members, people over which we have some level of influence, that if we act, then they will act. The first place that I ever preached regularly wasn't my idea. I had a friend named Alan, and Alan said, I think we could go to Cumbie, Texas every week and preach in that little congregation. I want you to go with me. And so I said, well, sure, I got nothing else going on Sunday afternoons. And so we started driving to Cumbie every Sunday afternoon. I picked up on his lead. He was going to do something. Later on, several years later, I had the opportunity to work with another young man who was kind of on the verge looking for something to do, and I was in ministry. And so he started going with me to be part of that ministry. And he began to do more in the kingdom. So all of us have people that are close to us that we can have an influence on them if we'll do something. He influenced his dad, who had a lot of influence over the rest of the army. So if we do something and then the leadership of the church says, oh, there's something going on, sometimes the leadership doesn't lead. Sometimes the leadership says, well, we've got something moving. Let's get in with the motion. Let's move with them and encourage them and help them to get things done. And they can help get people motivated to help in whatever's going on. There are people who should be in worship who are not. But if something exciting begins to happen in a local congregation, they say, that's my church. I should be at, I've worshiped there all my life. Well, I haven't been there in 10 years, but I've worshiped there all my life. And all of a sudden, they want to be part of it because there's something going on. So those that were in the Philistine camp came back. Sometimes members who have been hiding out or who have been in the enemy camp come back. And then, of course, he just gave courage to the cowards. There's some of us that have to have somebody pushing us to get us to do, right? And Jonathan gave them a push, and God gave them a victory. And because of that, they won a tremendous victory over the Philistines. And like I said, next week, we'll look at Saul's half of this, his response to what his son did. And notice some things that Saul did in a way that undid some of the great things that Jonathan had gotten done. Any questions or thoughts you want to add to that? Okay. If there's anything we can do for you by way of a public response, we'd love to help you as we stand and sing.